the 6th century, the Western Roman Empire was collapsing. Goths and Vandals moved across Europe. Education and the Christian tradition of learning went into decline, and teaching became a luxury. The church was corrupt, weak, and aimless. But right at the edge of the known world, there was an island where the Roman legions had never reached. Here, a new form of Christianity was to develop that would take the church back to the fervent simplicity of the first Christians. Monks sailing tiny sealskin boats would bring the fundamentalist spirit of the early church back into Europe, to France and Switzerland, and even to Italy itself. The message was to come from the island of Ireland. A 100 years earlier, a young boy called Patrick, who'd grown up as a Christian in Roman Britain, had been kidnapped by Irish pirates. He'd spent his youth as a slave, herding sheep on the Irish hillsides and praying to God.
After I came to Ireland, every day I had to tend sheep, and many times a day I prayed. The love and fear of God came to me more and more, and my faith was strengthened.
Eventually he was to escape, but in later years he would come back to Ireland, determined to convert the Irish to Christianity. There were already Christians in Ireland, but the country was mostly run by the pre-Christian religion of the Druids.
They had a variety of cult practices associated with wells and fountains. They also worshipped certain trees and standing stones, some of which were said to have been covered in gold and silver, and the scene of human sacrifice, at least the sacrifice of children.
Patrick confronted the power of the Druids with the power of Christianity. There was a law that said before the spring festival, all fires in Ireland had to be extinguished except the king's fire, from which all other fires would be rekindled. But Patrick defied the law and lit his own fire. Legend has it that when the Druids in the king's service tried to confront Patrick, they were overwhelmed by miraculous forces. Patrick's achievement in spreading the fire of Christianity is reenacted in churches throughout Ireland to this day. Patrick was a representative of the Roman Church, but Ireland was one of the only Christian places in Europe that had never been colonized by the Romans. Ireland had its own customs, its own law, even its own architecture, which was fundamentally different from the Roman traditions of the continent. And the church that was to develop in Ireland was to be quite different from the European church. The first Irish Christians looked for inspiration not to Europe, but to the other end of the Christian world, to the Church of Egypt, the Coptic Church. In the 3rd century, Antony, an Egyptian farmer, had become disgusted with the sensuality and materialism of the city. Antony sought to emulate Christ and the apostles who went into the wilderness to fight temptation. He went out into the desert to live in a cave, to fight his own spiritual battle with the devil and to grow nearer to God. When others followed him, attracted by his spirituality, they formed a community, and the first monastery was born. Other communities formed in the deserts of the Middle East, and the fame of the monastic system reached as far as Ireland.
The Irish would have been reading the lives of the Desert Fathers. They would have known about the Egyptian desert and where the Christian monks had gone to set themselves apart. We have tangible proof of this in things like high crosses, where we see scenes from the life of St. Anthony depicted.
There is a flowing of information and of influence along a conduit that comes from the heart of Coptic Christianity straight into the heart of Irish Christianity.
Many of the things that we think of as being quintessentially Irish, in fact, derive from the Coptic Church of Egypt. even the interlaced design of the illuminated manuscripts.
We have much talk of Celtic interlace as a form of ornamentation, but there is no pre-Christian Celtic interlace. But there is Coptic interlace.
We have place names in the west of Ireland even today, which have desert in the names of small towns. And obviously, originally, these were set up as little hermitages in a wilderness place, a place apart from society.
For many early Christian monks, the sea was the substitute for the wilderness. And they went off by sea in currachs or skin boats to find isolated areas in the midst of the great ocean, as they saw it, in which they could more meaningfully pursue their religious relationship with their God.
The ocean was the Irish equivalent of the desert. And so we can see in places like Skellig Michael, or in places like any of the island monasteries up and down the coast, the effect of the Desert Fathers. Here you had a monastery established on basically a rock out 8 miles out at sea, a little monastery built at the top of a mountain, beyond which nothing else was visible and nothing else was known. Small handful of men, probably only about a dozen. They probably came out in around the 6th century. They must have scrambled up the mountain and lived basically like the birds, lived very much in a wilderness place. God's power is often referred to as a mighty rock or a holy mountain, and his city is built at the top of this holy mountain. So if you think about monks spending hours, perhaps every day of their life, reciting these psalms to themselves in their dark cells and coming out and looking out at their surroundings in Skellig Michael, you can get an idea of just how holy a place they thought they inhabited. Because there they were in a little village on top of a mountain, stuck out at sea, apart from everything else, surrounded as it was by the bird life. It must have seemed like a particularly holy place, and an apt place to call upon God to engage in this spiritual battle.
The Irish monks emulated the Desert Fathers, not only in the places where they lived, but also in the severe penitential lives they led.
Their diets were horrendous, often vegetarian, not vegan. They did eat fish. And they had strange rules and regulations concerning diet as well.
Let the monks' food be poor and taken in the evening, such as to avoid repletion, and their drink, such as to avoid intoxication, so that it may both maintain life and not harm their souls. Vegetables, beans, flour mixed with water, together with a small loaf of bread, lest the stomach be burdened and the mind confused.
Chastity was fundamentally important to them. That's not to say they were always chaste, because if they were, we probably wouldn't have so many lists of punishments to be doled out to people who were unchaste. And these range from being forced to live on rocky islands on meager diets for months on end, to being forced to give up one's daily beer allowance for improprieties with choir boys.
The simple, devout life of the monks was immensely impressive to ordinary people. By the middle of the 6th century, monasteries were springing up all over Ireland, led by saints such as Finian of Clonard, Comgall of Bangor and Bridget of Kildare. While Ireland was isolated in comparative peace on the edge of Europe, the continental church had been fractured by the wars which had destroyed the Roman Empire. Libraries had been burnt, texts lost, and knowledge was endangered. But the Irish had a tradition of learning that stretched back to pre-Christian times.
The vernacular Irish language has a literature far earlier than any other country in Western Europe, and it's a very substantial literature, both in poetry and prose. That can't all have been composed by Christian scholars.
Even from the earliest of the monasteries, we can deduce a list of the books which existed in the library, and they had extensive access, not just to ecclesiastical and liturgical works, but to the classical works, philosophical works, treatises on this, that, and the other.
The pre-Christian Irish literature had been full of tales of marvelous events. These became incorporated into Irish Christianity as accounts of the miracles performed by the saints. Stories abounded, especially ones which drew their inspiration from the Irish love of nature. They told of how St. Michael revealed himself to Brendan in the guise of a bird, or how St. Barra of Cork stretched his hand into the water and drew out a salmon, or how a wild bear brought firewood for St. Gall. On the continent, they would have been frowned on by the church, but in Ireland, they flourished. Hagiographies, the lives of the saints, came to be a common form of literature. One of the most popular tells of the miracles performed by St. Brendan, known as the Navigator, who sailed out from County Kerry in a skin boat. St. Brendan came across an island made of glass and a strange land far out in the ocean. When a sea creature that spouted in the air threatened the saint, Brendan called on God to perform a miracle.
One day there appeared to them a beast of immense size following them from a distance. He spouted foam from his nostrils and ploughed through the waves at a great speed as if he were about to devour them. When the brothers saw this, they called upon the Lord, saying, "Deliver us, Lord, so that the beast does not devour us." After these pleas asking for deliverance, a mighty monster passed near them from the west, going to encounter the beast. He immediately attacked him, emitting fire from his mouth. The wretched beast that pursued the servants of Christ was cut into 3 pieces before their eyes. The other returned after his victory to where he had come from.
The stories may or may not have been true, but people wanted to believe them. They wanted to believe in the miraculous powers of the men and women who were running the great monasteries of Bangor and Clonmacnoise and Glendalough. These Irish monasteries were unique. In the absence of towns, which existed only where the Romans had been, the monasteries grew and took on some of the characteristics of towns.
The monasteries, in effect, became large monastic estates. They were also important centres of trade, and they trade in quite exotic materials, including dyes from the Mediterranean, wine from Atlantic France and Spain, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. And with that trade went all of this sort of collateral trade, and that passing stream of money sticks.
To some people, the Irish monasteries were becoming like the luxurious cities that St. Anthony and the first Irish monks had sought to escape. Those who wanted to live a life of exile for Christ would now have to go further afield.
People looked for a further venue for their exile outside of Ireland now. The Irish monks went further into the Atlantic. They crossed over into Scotland, and they went back to Europe. They weren't there primarily to convert the heathen. They were there, once again, to live this life of spiritual exile for the love of Christ.
One of the most ardent and uncompromising missionaries came from Bangor in County Down, St. Columbanus. He set sail with 12 companions, emulating Christ and the apostles. He worked his way across Europe, rowing up the Rhine and crossing the Alps, leaving behind him a trail of monasteries. As Columbanus crossed Europe, he found a church that had lost energy and fallen into decline. Ordinary people were attracted to the new idea of rigorous monasticism that the strangers were bringing with them, although the continental bishops were deeply suspicious.
Well, the whole emphasis of the church, the continental church, it seems to me, after about 411, when Augustine makes popular the idea of Christian mediocrity. You don't have to be a martyr, you know, you can slob out and be a Christian. And far out on the left wing, there's a shower of people who have gone back, you know, to the form of Christianity which embraced martyrdom and hardship and chastity and poverty and obedience. They must have been extremely tedious to urbane, civilized European Christians.
At first, St. Columbanus was greeted with enthusiasm by the king of the Franks, but his uncompromising ways soon led him into trouble.
The king asked him to bless his newly born sons, and unfortunately for the king, these sons had been born out of wedlock. And when the king made his request, Columbanus said he had no intention of baptizing children who'd come straight out of the whorehouse.
Columbanus was severe, arrogant, and constantly battling with the local clergy. But people were attracted by the new, more vigorous form of Christianity, and they flocked to his monasteries. As time went on, Irish monasteries were to blossom right across Europe. Many of them are still flourishing today. Columbanus' last foundation where he died was at Bobbio in the north of Italy. 1,500 years later, it is still a centre of learning.
Bobbio happens to be a monastery, a library, which preserved a tremendous, remarkable amount of otherwise lost classical Latin literature. Some works of Cicero, for example, which have survived nowhere else, survived in the library of Bobbio.
The churches that he founded, particularly Bobbio, have thrived to this day and represent a sort of spiritual donation, a paying back from the islands to Central Europe for the gift of Christianity.
The Irish saints, such as St. Columbanus, were respected as men and women of passionate faith who reminded the Church of its origins in the austerity of the deserts of the Middle East. The monastic system which they brought from the desert was to spread around the world, and with it the learning that they loved and preserved for later generations. At the same time, the Irish toleration of old pre-Christian traditions of storytelling meant that the saints were revered as having marvelous powers. From now on, it would be expected of saints that they would be able to perform miracles.